The 23rd of June, 1943, dawned over the Solomon Islands with an oppressive humidity that clung to every surface like a second skin. Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Army crouched behind a fallen palm tree on New Georgia, his binoculars trained on the American positions across Munda Point. What he witnessed that morning would fundamentally alter his understanding of modern warfare. Through the magnified lenses, he observed something that seemed impossible. American soldiers separated by hundreds of yards, moving in perfect coordination without runners, without flag signals, without any visible means of communication. They simply spoke into small devices attached to their belts and responded with mechanical precision. Yamamoto had commanded infantry companies for 3 years, first in China, then throughout the Pacific Campaign. He understood the brutal mathematics of battlefield communication. In every engagement, the side that could coordinate fastest held an insurmountable advantage. Japanese doctrine relied on pre-planned attacks, meticulous preparation, and runners who sprinted between units carrying orders written on rice paper. This system had served the emperor adequately against Chinese forces and during the early Pacific offensives. But here, watching the Americans maneuver with supernatural unity, Yamamoto realized his army was fighting with antiquated tools against an opponent who had achieved something approaching telepathy. The device responsible for this revolution was the SCR-536, known colloquially among American troops as the handy-talkie. Motorola had designed it specifically for infantry use, a compact frequency-modulated transceiver that could fit in a soldier's hand. According to documents later captured by Japanese intelligence officers, each American battalion possessed approximately 83 tactical radios, distributed from company level down to individual squad leaders. By contrast, Japanese battalions typically fielded 8 to 10 radios, all concentrated at battalion and regimental headquarters. The numerical disparity was staggering. American forces enjoyed a 10-to-1 advantage in tactical communication equipment. Lieutenant Thomas McKinley of the United States Marine Corps 3rd Raider Battalion exemplified this new warfare paradigm. On that same June morning, McKinley led his platoon through dense jungle toward a suspected Japanese observation post. His SCR-536 crackled with constant updates from neighboring units, artillery observers, and his company commander. When his point man spotted enemy movement, McKinley didn't need to send a runner back to headquarters or fire signal flares that would reveal his position. He simply depressed the transmit button and whispered coordinates into the receiver. Within minutes, mortar shells began falling on the Japanese position with devastating accuracy. This technological asymmetry had profound implications that extended far beyond individual skirmishes. The handy-talkie represented America's industrial capacity, translated into tactical superiority. Each radio contained dozens of precisely manufactured vacuum tubes, capacitors, and resistors that required advanced production facilities. Japan's industry, already strained by resource shortages and Allied bombing campaigns, could not replicate this technology at scale. Even when Japanese engineers captured intact SCR-536s and attempted reverse engineering, the manufacturing infrastructure simply didn't exist to produce equivalent numbers. Major General Oscar Griswold, commanding the 14th Corps during the New Georgia campaign, understood the strategic implications immediately. In his after-action report filed on the 7th of July, 1943, he noted that the proliferation of tactical radios had reduced his casualty rates by approximately 30% compared to earlier Guadalcanal operations. His infantry companies could call for fire support within seconds, request medical evacuations instantly, and coordinate flanking maneuvers with unprecedented speed. The development story of the SCR-536 began not on Pacific battlefields, but in cramped Chicago laboratories during the bitter winter of 1941. Daniel Noble, chief engineer at Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, soon to be renamed Motorola, received an urgent visit from Army Signal Corps representatives on the 14th of December, exactly a week after Pearl Harbor. The military needed portable radio equipment immediately, something infantrymen could carry into combat without requiring dedicated radio operators or multiple batteries. Noble's team had been experimenting with frequency modulation technology, a relatively new approach that offered clearer voice transmission than traditional amplitude modulation systems. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. Traditional military radios weighed 30 to 40 pounds, required external power sources, and needed skilled operators who understood Morse code. The Army wanted something a single soldier could operate while running, climbing, or crawling through mud. It needed to be intuitive enough that exhausted, terrified men could use it under fire without extensive training. Most critically, it had to be manufacturable in enormous quantities using materials that weren't already allocated to aircraft production or naval construction. Noble's solution drew inspiration from civilian police radios and commercial broadcasting equipment. The SCR-536 employed frequency modulation in the 40 to 48 MHz band, using a super-regenerative receiver that was simpler and lighter than super-heterodyne designs. The entire unit measured approximately 13 inches tall, weighed just 5 pounds including batteries, and could transmit clear voice signals up to 1 mile under ideal conditions. In dense jungle or urban environments, that range dropped to perhaps 300 yards, but even that represented a revolutionary capability for frontline troops. According to an article published in the March 1944 edition of Electronics magazine, a technical journal that documented wartime innovations, the first production SCR-536s rolled off Motorola's assembly lines in May 1942. The article noted that Motorola's manufacturing capacity grew from producing 50 radios daily in mid-1942 to over 400 units per day by early 1943. This industrial scaling proved as important as the technological innovation itself. Context for this production information comes from declassified War Production Board documents that tracked military electronics manufacturing. Sergeant William Chen of the 6th Army's Communications Platoon became one of the first soldiers to field test the handy-talkie during maneuvers at Camp Roberts, California, in July 1942. Chen, who had emigrated from Canton before the war, possessed technical aptitude that made him invaluable to the Signal Corps. He spent weeks testing the device under simulated combat conditions, crawling through obstacle courses, wading through water obstacles, enduring scorching desert heat and freezing mountain cold. The radio performed admirably in most conditions, though extreme cold reduced battery life significantly. The real revelation came during mock battles against enemy forces. Chen's squad could coordinate ambushes, call for reinforcements, and redirect mortar fire in real time, capabilities that previously required complex pre-planning or exposed runners. The opposing force, equipped with traditional communication methods, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered. Company commanders who initially doubted the radio's utility became evangelical advocates after observing its battlefield applications. Japanese military observers, lacking access to American industrial facilities or technical publications, could only guess at how their opponents had achieved such communication superiority. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the Imperial Army's most experienced staff officers, captured an intact SCR-536 during fighting on Bougainville in November 1943. He personally transported the device back to Tokyo, where technicians at the Army Technical Research Institute disassembled it component by component. Their detailed report, discovered in archives after the war, revealed both admiration for American engineering and despair at Japan's inability to match it. Private First Class Kenji Watanabe huddled in a waterlogged foxhole on Bougainville Island as the 20th of November, 1943, dissolved into chaos around him. Artillery shells screamed overhead, American and Japanese, their origins impossible to distinguish through the cacophony. Watanabe's company had been ordered to hold a ridgeline overlooking Empress Augusta Bay, but those orders were now 6 hours old. The battlefield had transformed completely since dawn. American forces had infiltrated to the north. A desperate counterattack had failed to the south, and Watanabe had no idea whether he should hold position, retreat, or advance. His company commander lay dead 300 yards behind the lines, killed by a sniper during the initial American bombardment. The battalion headquarters runner who had been sent forward at noon had never returned, probably killed, possibly captured, perhaps simply lost in the jungle maze. Watanabe and the 40 men clustered along his section of trench made decisions based on instinct and immediate threats, completely isolated from higher command. They were blind soldiers in a battle they couldn't see, making tactical choices that would determine whether they lived or died. 2 ridges away, Corporal James Washington of the 3rd Marine Division faced the same battlefield from the opposite perspective. Washington's SCR-536 hung from his belt, its small speaker delivering a constant stream of information. His platoon leader reported enemy movement to the west. Artillery observers called corrections to counter battery fire. Company headquarters requested a status update, which Washington provided in 15 seconds. The company commander immediately radioed back new orders: hold current position, prepare to support a flanking attack from the 2nd platoon. This information asymmetry created a multiplier effect that transcended simple tactical advantage. American units could concentrate force at decisive points because commanders possessed real-time intelligence. Japanese forces, operating with hours-old information, consistently committed troops to positions the Americans had already abandoned or prepared ambushes at locations the enemy had deliberately vacated. The fog of war, that eternal companion of combat, afflicted both sides unequally. The human toll of this technological disparity became apparent in casualty statistics compiled after the war. During the Bougainville campaign, which lasted from November 1943 through March 9, 1844, American forces suffered approximately 730 combat deaths. Japanese casualties exceeded 18,000 killed. While multiple factors contributed to this disparity, air superiority, naval bombardment, logistics, communications played a significant role. American wounded received medical evacuation within hours because corpsmen could radio for assistance. Japanese wounded often died in the jungle because their comrades couldn't communicate with rear area hospitals. Colonel Hideki Nakano, a staff officer at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, compiled a comprehensive report on American communications superiority in February 1944. His analysis, based on interrogations of prisoners and examination of captured equipment, concluded that Japanese forces were fighting blind against an enemy who can see. Nakano recommended immediate industrial mobilization to produce tactical radios, but his report arrived as American submarines were systematically destroying the merchant fleet that carried raw materials to Japanese factories. The industrial capacity to close the communications gap simply no longer existed. Technical Sergeant Dorothy Chen, no relation to William Chen mentioned earlier, worked at the Signal Intelligence Service Station in Melbourne, Australia, throughout 1943 and 1944. Her duties included intercepting Japanese military communications and analyzing their patterns. Chen noticed that Japanese radio traffic decreased dramatically during CFY's combat operations, suggesting commanders were either maintaining radio silence or lacked sufficient equipment. By contrast, American tactical frequencies crackled with constant communication during engagements. This pattern revealed a fundamental difference in military philosophy. American forces treated information sharing as essential to victory, while Japanese doctrine emphasized predetermined plans executed regardless of changing circumstances. The 1st of March 1944 brought unseasonable rain to Tokyo, but inside the cramped offices of the Army Technical Research Institute, Colonel Saburo Hayashi barely noticed the weather. Spread across his desk lay components from 3 captured SCR-536s, each radio painstakingly disassembled by the Institute's best technicians. Hayashi, who had studied electrical engineering at Imperial University before the war, understood exactly what these components represented and what they demanded. The radio's vacuum tubes required precision glass blowing and metal alloys, already in critical shortage. Its capacitors needed specific dielectrics that Japan's chemical industry couldn't produce in quantity. Even the plastic casing required petroleum derivatives that the Navy desperately needed for aviation fuel. Hayashi drafted a memorandum to General Hideki Tojo, then serving as both Prime Minister and Minister of War, outlining the grim mathematics of radio production. Japan's entire vacuum tube manufacturing capacity currently produced approximately 70,000 units monthly, almost entirely allocated to aircraft radios, naval equipment, and strategic communications. Equipping the infantry with American-style tactical radios would require an additional 500,000 tubes monthly, more than 7 times current production. Building the factories to manufacture those tubes would take 18 months minimum and consume steel, concrete, and machinery that were already desperately scarce. The report concluded with a sentence that captured Japan's fundamental industrial disadvantage. The enemy possesses not merely superior technology, but the industrial capacity to deploy that technology at scale we cannot match. This context regarding Japanese industrial limitations comes from post-war interviews with surviving technical personnel conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey in 1946. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American industry operated at a scale that would have seemed fantastical before the war. Motorola's main production facility in Chicago employed over 4,000 workers by spring 1944, operating 3 shifts daily. The assembly line for the SCR-536 had evolved into a model of efficiency. Women workers, many of whom had never held factory jobs before Pearl Harbor, assembled radios at a rate that would have impressed Henry Ford. Each radio required approximately 240 individual components, all of which had to meet strict military specifications for durability and performance. Mary Richardson had joined Motorola's production line in June 1942, 1 month after her husband deployed to North Africa with the 1st Armored Division. She worked the evening shift, fitting vacuum tubes into chassis with practiced precision. Richardson and her colleagues rarely thought about the battlefield implications of their work. They focused on quotas, quality control, and the small satisfactions of skilled labor. But each radio they assembled represented a technological advantage that would help American soldiers survive combat. The strategic implications extended beyond individual battles. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping campaign relied fundamentally on the ability to coordinate complex amphibious assaults involving Army infantry, Marine assault units, naval gunfire support, and tactical airstrikes. These operations required split-second timing and constant communication between elements that traditional methods, flag signals, runners, predetermined plans, couldn't provide. The proliferation of tactical radios made MacArthur's entire strategic approach possible. During the landing at Hollandia, New Guinea, on the 22nd of April, 1944, American forces employed over 1,200 tactical radios across the assault divisions. Company commanders coordinated with naval liaison officers to direct destroyer fire onto specific pillboxes. Forward air controllers guided fighter bombers to targets barely 300 yards ahead of advancing infantry. Medical evacuation teams received requests for assistance and responded within minutes. The entire operation functioned as an integrated system rather than isolated units executing predetermined plans. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commanding Japanese forces in New Guinea, possessed perhaps 30 functioning radios across his entire 18th Army. His divisional commanders received orders via telephone lines that Allied bombing frequently severed, or through motorcycle couriers who required hours to traverse mountain roads. When American forces landed at Hollandia, Adachi didn't learn of the invasion until noon, 5 hours after the first wave hit the beaches. By the time his counterattack orders reached forward units, American forces had already secured their beachhead and established defensive positions. The 15th of June, 1944, marked the beginning of the Mariana Islands campaign, and with it came the most sophisticated American coordination yet witnessed in the Pacific theater. On Saipan's beaches, Marine companies pushed inland with a level of tactical flexibility that would have been impossible 18 months earlier. Each rifle platoon possessed at least 2 SCR-536s, allowing squad leaders to communicate directly with company headquarters, artillery observers, and neighboring units. The result was a fluid battlefield where American forces could rapidly concentrate combat power at critical junctures while avoiding Japanese strongpoints that would have previously required costly frontal assaults. Major General Holland Smith, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, established his command post less than 800 yards from the front lines, a proximity unthinkable in previous campaigns. Smith could maintain direct radio contact with all subordinate units, receiving updates AID and issuing orders in real time. Japanese counterattacks that might have caused confusion and panic in earlier battles were identified early, reported immediately, and crushed by concentrated artillery fire directed by forward observers with handheld radios. The Japanese defenders, by contrast, struggled with fragmented communication. Colonel Takashi Goto commanded the 43rd Division's Infantry Brigade, defending Saipan's Central Highlands. Goto's headquarters possessed 3 functioning radios when the battle began. America. In naval bombardment destroyed 2 during the first day. The surviving radio's batteries died on the 3rd day, and replacement batteries never arrived because the supply runner was killed by artillery. For the final 2 weeks of the battle, Goto commanded his units through written orders carried by runners, a method that had been obsolete for decades in industrial warfare. The technological gap manifested in unexpected ways that went beyond simple tactical coordination. American forces used their radios to coordinate medical evacuations with unprecedented efficiency. Corpsman Robert Schultz, serving with the 2nd Marine Division, could request evacuation for wounded men and receive pickup within 30 minutes. Navy hospital ships stationed offshore maintained radio contact with beach medical stations, allowing doctors to prepare for incoming casualties and pre-position rare blood types. Japanese wounded, lacking similar communication infrastructure, often remained on the battlefield for days before reaching medical care, if they survived that long. This information regarding medical evacuation procedures draws from the official Marine Corps history, Victory and Occupation, published in 1948 by the Historical Branch, G3 Division, Headquarters United States Marine Corps. The detailed accounts of radio usage in medical evacuation illustrate how tactical communications created cascading advantages beyond immediate combat applications. Japanese military leadership recognized their disadvantage, but lacked means to address it. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, overall commander of Saipan's defense, possessed only intermittent radio contact with Tokyo. His requests for reinforcement, ammunition resupply, and air support often went unanswered. Not because Imperial headquarters refused, but because the messages never arrived, or arrived so late that circumstances had completely changed. Saito made decisions based on intelligence that was often days old, while his American counterparts operated with information measured in minutes. The psychological impact of this communication disparity affected both sides profoundly. American soldiers developed confidence that help was always just a radio call away. Even small units operating independently knew they could request artillery support, airstrikes, or reinforcement if they encountered superior enemy forces. This confidence encouraged aggressive patrolling and bold tactical decisions that kept Japanese forces constantly off balance. Japanese soldiers experienced the opposite psychological dynamic. They operated knowing that calling for help was often impossible, that reinforcements might never arrive, that they were fundamentally alone, regardless of how close friendly units might be geographically. This isolation encouraged the desperate banzai charges and suicidal last stands that characterized so much of the Pacific War's final years. Not from samurai fatalism, but from rational calculation that coordinated tactical retreats and defensive repositioning were simply impossible without functioning communications. The 28th of August, 1944, found Major Edwin Howard Armstrong sitting in his Columbia University office, reading reports from the Pacific with quiet satisfaction. Armstrong, the inventor of frequency modulation radio technology, had spent the 1930s fighting legal battles with RCA and other corporations that dismissed his innovations. The military. Airie's adoption of FM technology for tactical radios vindicated his decades of research, but more importantly, the battlefield success of the SCR-536 demonstrated a fundamental principle Armstrong had long advocated: that clear, reliable communication represented the foundation of all coordinated human activity, whether civilian or military. American military doctrine had evolved significantly since Pearl Harbor, driven partly by technological capability, but also by philosophical shifts in understanding warfare. The Army's Field Manual 3-5, published in July 1943, explicitly stated that modern battle requires continuous communication between all echelons of command. This represented a dramatic departure from earlier doctrine that emphasized rigid adherence to predetermined plans. American commanders were encouraged to exercise initiative, adapt to changing circumstances, and communicate constantly with adjacent units and higher headquarters. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, articulated this philosophy in a November 1943 memorandum to theater commanders. The side that can process information faster and act on that information more quickly possesses an advantage that multiplies force effectiveness beyond mere numbers. Marshall understood that tactical radios weren't simply tools for giving orders. They enabled a fundamentally different approach to warfare based on distributed decision-making and rapid adaptation. Japanese military philosophy, by contrast, emphasized meticulous planning and unwavering execution. The concept of gekkokujo, subordinates defying superiors, carried such negative connotations that field commanders rarely deviated from orders even when circumstances rendered those orders obsolete. Radio communication, in Japanese doctrine, served primarily to transmit orders downward from higher headquarters rather than to enable horizontal coordination between units or to send intelligence upward from frontline troops. This philosophical difference manifested in organizational structure. American infantry companies distributed radios to platoon and squad leaders, empowering junior officers and non-commissioned officers to make tactical decisions and coordinate with adjacent units independently. Japanese companies concentrated radios at company and battalion headquarters, maintaining strict hierarchical control over communications. Even when Japan managed to produce tactical radios in limited quantities, doctrine discouraged their distribution to junior leaders. Captain Teruo Nakamura, a company commander in the 2nd Infantry Division, exemplified both the strengths and limitations of Japanese military philosophy. Nakamura was an exceptional officer, brave, intelligent, beloved by his men. During fighting on Peleliu in September 1944, he executed a brilliant tactical withdrawal when his position became untenable, saving most of his company from encirclement. But Nakamura's withdrawal violated his battalion commander's orders to hold at all costs, and he faced severe reprimand despite his tactical success. The incident illustrated how Japanese doctrine punished the initiative and adaptability that American doctrine encouraged. The technological disparity also reflected broader differences in how the two societies approached manufacturing and innovation. American industry embraced mass production of standardized components, interchangeable parts that allowed rapid assembly and field repair. When an SCR-536 failed, soldiers could often replace a defective vacuum tube or battery pack and return the radio to service within minutes. Japanese equipment, produced in smaller quantities with less standardization, required specialized repair that was often impossible in combat conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Murray Fromson, serving with the Signal Corps in the Southwest Pacific, documented this maintenance advantage in his after-action reports. Fromson noted that American units maintained approximately 85% of their radios in operational condition, despite the harsh tropical environment. Japanese units, according to intelligence gathered from prisoners and captured documents, rarely maintained more than 50% functionality, and that percentage declined steadily as the war progressed and supply lines deteriorated. The 6th of February 1945 brought General Douglas MacArthur's forces to Manila Bay, and with them came the most extensive radio network yet deployed in the Pacific War. The assault on Manila involved coordinating 7 divisions, numerous independent battalions, Filipino guerrilla units, and constant close air support, a logistical and tactical challenge that would have been impossible without extensive tactical communications. American forces employed over 2,000 SCR-536s during the Manila campaign, creating a communications network of unprecedented density. The Battle for Manila demonstrated how thoroughly tactical radios had been integrated into American military operations. Combat engineers coordinating bridge repairs communicated directly with infantry companies awaiting crossing sites. Tank destroyers received immediate fire missions from forward observers who spotted Japanese armor. Military police directing refugee evacuation coordinated with combat units to establish safe corridors through active battle zones. The entire operation functioned as an integrated system, each element aware of the other's status and needs. Japanese forces defending Manila, commanded by Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, fought with desperate courage but severely limited coordination. Iwabuchi's defensive plan relied on fortified positions throughout the city, but he possessed insufficient radios to maintain contact with all strongpoints. As American forces isolated individual positions, Japanese defenders had no way to coordinate counterattacks, request reinforcement, or receive updated orders. They fought and died in isolation, each strongpoint unaware of the larger battle's progress. By this stage of the war, Japan's radio production had essentially collapsed. American submarine warfare had severed supply lines carrying raw materials. Strategic bombing had destroyed key manufacturing facilities. The workers who possessed specialized skills for radio assembly had been drafted into the military or dispersed to avoid air raids. Lieutenant General Sugiyama, newly appointed Minister of War, received reports estimating that Japanese forces across all Pacific theaters possessed fewer functioning tactical radios in February 1945 than a single American division. The Iwo Jima campaign, beginning on the 19th of February 1945, illustrated the cumulative effect of communication superiority across 3 years of war. Marine divisions landing on Iwo Jima's beaches operated with a level of coordination that would have astounded observers from earlier campaigns. Forward air controllers directed fighter-bomber strikes against pillboxes barely 100 yards ahead of advancing infantry. Naval gunfire liaison officers walked artillery barrages forward with precision that minimized friendly fire casualties. Medical evacuation proceeded so efficiently that wounded Marines reached hospital ships within an hour of injury in most cases. Japanese defenders, commanded by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, fought with extraordinary skill and determination, despite overwhelming disadvantages. Kuribayashi had designed an elaborate defensive system with mutually supporting positions and extensive tunnels. But his forces possessed almost no tactical radios, perhaps 20 functioning sets across the entire garrison of 21,000 men. Kuribayashi couldn't coordinate counterattacks between separated defensive positions, couldn't redirect reserves to threatened sectors, couldn't even maintain reliable communication with his own subordinate commanders. The battle lasted until the 26th of March 1945 and cost nearly 7,000 American lives, the highest Marine casualties of any Pacific battle. But Japanese casualties exceeded 18,000 killed, with fewer than 300 prisoners taken. The disparity reflected not merely American advantages in firepower and logistics, but the fundamental inability of Japanese forces to coordinate defense, concentrate forces at decisive points, or adapt tactics to changing battlefield conditions, all consequences of inadequate communications infrastructure. Technical Sergeant James Chen, stationed with intelligence units in Guam, spent the spring of 1945 analyzing captured Japanese documents and interrogating prisoners. Chen's reports consistently emphasized that Japanese prisoners expressed astonishment at American communication capabilities. One captured officer, a major who had commanded an infantry battalion, stated that American forces seemed to possess supernatural awareness of battlefield conditions. The officer couldn't comprehend how American units anticipated Japanese movements, concentrated force at critical junctures, and avoided carefully prepared ambushes, all consequences of the tactical radio network he had no experience with. The 2nd of September, 1945, brought Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri, but the technological revolution catalyzed by the SCR-536 would continue shaping military doctrine and civilian innovation for decades. The radio that had provided American forces with such decisive tactical advantages during the Pacific War represented more than simply a clever engineering solution. It embodied a fundamental transformation in how military organizations could function and how information technology could enhance human coordination. In the war's immediate aftermath, military historians and analysts began comprehensively documenting the radio's impact. Colonel Samuel Thompson, assigned to the Army's Historical Division, compiled extensive statistics demonstrating that American casualty rates decreased by approximately 35% in campaigns where tactical radios were widely distributed compared to earlier operations relying on traditional communication methods. Thompson's analysis controlled for other factors like air superiority and artillery support, isolating the specific contribution of tactical communications to combat effectiveness. The Japanese military establishment, undergoing fundamental restructuring under American occupation, studied their communication failures with painful honesty. Major General Makoto Matsutani, serving on the Post-War Strategic Analysis Committee, authored a comprehensive report titled Communications Failure as Decisive Factor in Pacific Defeat. Matsutani argued that Japan's inability to match American tactical radio proliferation represented not merely an industrial or technological failure, but a failure of military imagination. Japanese doctrine had never fully recognized how profoundly real-time communication could transform combat operations. The civilian applications of wartime radio technology emerged rapidly. Motorola's engineers, many of whom had spent the war years perfecting the SCR-536, immediately began adapting their designs for commercial use. The first commercial mobile radios for police departments appeared in 1946, using technology directly derived from military handy-talkies. By 1948, taxi companies, delivery services, and construction firms were adopting mobile radio systems that would have been impossible without wartime innovation. Daniel Noble, whose engineering team had created the original SCR-536 design, reflected on the radio's legacy in a 1952 speech to the Institute of Radio Engineers. "We set out to solve a military problem, how to give every soldier the ability to communicate instantly with his comrades. What we actually created was a blueprint for mobile communication that would eventually transform civilian life as profoundly as it transformed warfare." The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, demonstrated both the enduring value of tactical radios and their continued evolution. American forces entered that conflict with improved versions of the wartime handy-talkie, now lighter, more reliable, and with longer battery life. North Korean and Chinese forces initially lacked similar equipment, though the Soviet Union rapidly supplied tactical radios to their allies, a tacit acknowledgement that modern warfare required distributed communication infrastructure. Veterans of the Pacific War who had carried the SCR-536 into combat often kept their wartime radios as treasured souvenirs. Robert Schultz, the corpsman who had used his radio to coordinate medical evacuations on Saipan, kept his original unit on display in his home until his death in 1998. In interviews conducted during the 1980s and 1990s, Pacific War veterans consistently cited tactical radios as among the most important tools of their combat experience, more valued than specific weapons or equipment, because the radio had made survival possible and connected them to their comrades in the most desperate circumstances. The mathematical reality of the radio disparity, American battalions possessing 10 times more tactical radios than their Japanese counterparts, translated into a compound tactical advantage that few contemporary observers fully appreciated. Each additional radio didn't simply add incremental communication capacity, it enabled exponentially more complex coordination. A platoon with 2 radios could split into separate elements and still maintain coordination. A company with 8 radios could execute simultaneous maneuvers that would have required careful pre-planning and rigid adherence to predetermined schedules just years earlier. By the 21st century, the handheld radio had evolved into smartphones and tactical communication systems that would have seemed like science fiction to the engineers who designed the SCR-536. But the fundamental principle remained unchanged. The organization that can share information most rapidly, distribute awareness most widely, and coordinate action most effectively possesses an advantage that multiplies its effectiveness beyond simple numerical superiority. The stunned Japanese observers who first witnessed American soldiers coordinating with handheld radios in the Solomon Islands during 1943 had glimpsed the future of warfare, a future where information technology would prove as decisive as firepower, logistics, or strategy. That future had arrived with a 5-pound device that fit in a soldier's hand, forever changing how humans would communicate in combat, and eventually, in everyday life.